All right, everyone, the good weather is starting. And so today I'm going to go ahead and start getting the roof rafters in place. Basically, I needed these two side walls to be complete because they really hold up the edges of the rafters. But there's going to be a structural ridge beam that they all lean against. Supposedly that makes it easier to install. This doesn't have to be a code compliant building. So it's not 100% necessary, but I can't really frame the small walls, the one on the front and the one in the back, until I get those rafters in place because I don't really know how to cut the framing. I'm sure there's ways to calculate it, but one thing that I've learned is that my SketchUp drawing is not 100% accurate compared to the real world measurements. So I think the easiest way to do it is to get the front gable put up, the back gable put up, put a ridge beam across, and somehow tack it in place to make sure the measurements are good. And then I can start building these other walls. So I'm going to start on that now. All right, what you just saw me do was create a mock-up of the roof rafter system. I basically wanted the two rafters on the back tacked in place and the two rafters in the front tacked in place. And that proves that I have the correct angle and the correct placement of the bird's mouth. I also needed to put those in place before I could cut the wall studs on the back. I was using those as kind of a way to trace the appropriate angle on top of my stud rather than trying to use math to figure out exactly where it goes. And math's a good way to go if you have materials that are more consistent than I have, but because our 2x8s are reclaimed, things are a bit warped and cupped in different dimensions, so it's a bit easier to just get stuff in place and then trace the lines. So you can see I have angled cuts on those two back studs, and those studs are going to act as some supports to hold up the rafters. And once I got those four rafters mocked up, I was able to determine exactly where the structural ridge beam needed to fit. And that may not be that hard to figure out for carpenters that are used to doing this, but I wanted to have a center stud on each end that supports the structural ridge beam, and I wanted that to be cut exactly the same height on both ends, so the ridge beam would have continuous support. One issue I ran into, though, is I didn't have any boards long enough to accommodate the length of the building plus the overhangs for the ridge beam, so I had to splice it over a wall, an interior wall that's not yet built, but it will be. So right now it's just kind of tacked in place, but it'll be a lot stronger later once I get some more fasteners in place. So now it's time to move forward with the roof rafters. Another warm day on the homestead. The high is going to be 70 degrees today. That's pretty crazy for winter, but after all that snow, I'm not going to complain. So my goal for this morning is to get the rest of these roof rafters in position. I already have them mostly cut. I need to go grab some more of this lumber from our pile of reclaimed roof rafters that we brought with us in the shipping container from Raleigh. They've been in our shipping container for a couple years now, so they're essentially kiln dried at this point. They're way lighter than they were when we first got them. They were pretty saturated originally, and I struggled to even carry one of these by myself. And now I can carry a couple at a time, if that tells you anything about the weight. So I need to get up here, probably move my temporary scaffold around a bit, just to try to figure out if all of the rafters are going to fit exactly where I want them to go. They're going to be spaced 2 feet on center. The load is going to be transferred straight down from each rafter to the stud below. It's kind of using advanced framing principles. Essentially, this is going to be like a code compliant building. I have the bracing across. I'm going to put some hurricane ties on it. And it's brand new lumber for everything else except for the roof. And these are way oversized, but we just need to use them up because I'm tired of trying to keep these things dry. We have a bunch of metal here from the roof project when we lived down in Raleigh. I got new roofing put over all the living space. I just didn't have time before our move to put new roofing over the porch. So that's why we have that. That's going to be most of the siding. I have a couple pieces of T111 that can fill in the gaps where I don't have enough of that metal. And then the only material I purchased for the outside is that stack of just conventional galvanized aluminum roofing. It's not the exact same style as this stuff. This is like the thinner gauge 5V that they use for like agricultural buildings. But our local Amish supplier, Mod Metals, shout out to them. They bend and form their own metal from the coils, so it's very affordable. So I'm excited to finally get that up here and keep our stuff dry. I just need to knock out the roof framing first. So let's get back to work. All right, so let's talk a little bit about my rafter template. You saw in an earlier time lapse how I was kind of mocking up the rafters. The first thing you really need to know is your roof pitch, because that's going to determine that angle that you see here on the left side of the screen, where it touches the structural ridge beam. That angle is very important because if your gap is too big, your fasteners are not going to hold this flush. So now that I have the roof pitch established, I can go ahead and trace this onto the next board. And I like to trace this angle as close as I can to the edge of the board to reduce waste. Now that I have that, I can go ahead to the other end, which is essentially cutting it to length before I need to cut the bird's mouth, which is just a triangular notch on the underside of every rafter so it can sit on top of the wall below. I want my bird's mouth to be big enough to have about 3 inches of overlap on the wall below, and that'll make it very sturdy, and that'll make it a lot easier to secure the rafter to the wall below. Once I get a fresh battery, I'll show you how I make this cut. I hold the guard open on the circular saw, and then I overcut it so that there's enough cut to allow this triangular wedge to simply fall out. If you cut just to your line, then because of the curvature of your blade, you'll have to go back with another type of saw to complete the cut. It doesn't matter that I overcut a little bit on a 2x8 because I'm getting nowhere close to compromising the structural integrity of the board. If I was using 2x4s, I'd have to be a bit more careful. And I could probably get away with 2x4s on a building this small, but because I have these salvage 2x8s, I'm deciding to just use them, and I don't really feel like ripping them all in half. And now the next step for me is to measure layout and transfer those measurements to the ridge beam and the top plate of my walls. In this case, my typical rafters are spaced 2 feet on center. That means they have a 2-foot spacing, but only measured from the same side of the board. So you can either measure from the center of every rafter to the center of the next, or you can measure from the left side of one rafter to the left side of the next. As long as you measure from the same point on every rafter, you'll be good to go. I actually don't have a lot of measuring to do for the layout on top of the wall because the rafters are going to match the spacing that my wall studs have already achieved, which is 2 feet on center. I'm able to balance each cut rafter on top of the wall because the bird's mouth is so precise. And once I align that with my layout marks on the top and the studs on the bottom, I can toenail near the bird's mouth directly into the top plate. And to fasten the rafter to the structural ridge beam, I can fire nails directly through for the first side and then shoot them in through the back at an angle, or toenail them from the front on the other side. I can tell you from experience that as long as your template was good to go from the beginning and all of your subsequent rafters match that, then this is a pretty smooth operation using the structural ridge beam as a backstop for all of these rafters. If I was a bit taller, I could have simply placed them all without building this scaffold. And now that the rafters are done, we can move on to the bird blocking. And those are essentially just blocks of wood cut to plug the hole between the rafters so birds can't land on top of your wall and enter the building. In a residential attic, you would want your bird blocking to have holes in it for airflow, and you would need to have some sort of screen or mesh blocking those holes so birds would not be able to enter the attic. I'm not going to have any structural sheathing on top of these rafters that are going to block the airflow, so I'm not too concerned about those holes. There's also going to be plenty of gaps in the siding that are going to allow air to come in and breathe. There's no drywall in there to block off the attic, and I'm going to have a ridge vent to allow the hot air to escape as it rises up to the roof. But we could talk more about that stuff when we get to the roof assembly video. For now, let's just focus on this bird blocking. I'm making these out of the cutoff scraps from the end of the roof rafters, and I'm adjusting the angle of my saw to match that of the roof pitch. That way it can go all the way up to my roof metal without allowing much of a gap for birds to enter. I'm also using my speed square to draw a consistent line from one end of the board to the other, and that acts as my little template guide for the circular saw. I'm actually running into a bit of an issue with these because my 2x8s are not all consistently milled. These were from old growth pine in an old residential attic, so all of these are a bit different in dimension. And also, there's a bit of some warping and cupping in the rafters that's causing me to have to come back and recut some of these. This is all a side effect of using reclaimed lumber, and you might not have these issues with consistently milled new lumber, although it's not going to be as strong as old growth pine. If all of your lumber was the same dimension, then the width of these bird blocks would be all the same, and you could cut them all in bulk and then simply hammer them into place for a good friction fit before nailing. That's basically what I did, with the exception of those few that I had to modify. But because I have a few of these 2x4s going across the ceiling, I did have to notch a few of the bird blocks just to accommodate those. And the reason I have 2x4s going across is because it helps stabilize the walls. I have one on each end for the exterior walls, but then I also have one in the middle for our partition wall. Here's an aerial view, just so you can see what I'm talking about. A structural sheathed roof deck would be overkill on a build this size, so I'm going to put horizontal purlins going across. That's going to span the gaps between the rafters so I have somewhere to screw the metal roofing into. And I'm going to put these nails in place so I have somewhere to hook my string line on to snap horizontal chalk lines across, and that's going to give me a straight line indicator so I know where to cut notches. You could put purlins straight on top of your rafters if you don't mind having a gap, but I want my roof to sit flush on the rafters so we don't get a lot of uplift from the crazy winds we have up here on the mountain. So basically, I'm running the string line a couple times. I'm using my speed square to measure the exact width of my purlins. In this case, I'm using 1x furring strips. And that basically just means that they were cut at 1.5 inches, basically ripped off a table saw from a 2x4 into very thin strips. Usually strips of this size would be too small for a building, but I think it's going to be perfect for a chicken coop of this size. My metal roof panels are only going to be, I think, about 6 feet long, just to get to the rafter tails on the overhang you see here. And so there's actually not going to be a lot of area for it to uplift from. I just need to make sure they're secured every 2 feet because that's usually the recommendation from the roofing manufacturers. You could definitely use a circular saw, pass it multiple times, and then chisel out the notch. But in my experience, I find I have a bit more control and consistency using the router. So I'm basically just routing out the exact width of the furring strips, and then I'll be able to slide those into place and secure them with a ring shank nail from my nail gun. So I mentioned my notch would be 1.5 inches wide to accommodate the furring strip, but the depth only needs to be 3/4 of an inch because that's how thick the furring strips are. So I really don't have to go down that deep, which means I can make one pass very slowly using the router here. And this is just a Milwaukee trim router. You definitely want a sharp bit if you're doing very large openings, such as like a window opening through OSB or something like that. But this old growth pine is very dry and it's pretty easy to cut. There's actually some rot and some nail holes and things like that that assist me in cutting through this wood. So some areas are definitely easier than others. But as you can see here, I don't really have any issues reaching to where I need to get to. I can do it left-handed and right-handed. I just need to be very slow and methodical about how I do this. And you can see when I go to install the furring strips that I'm putting the splice directly in the center of the middle rafter. And that's going to allow me to put one nail at an angle from each furring strip into that same rafter, and then I don't have to use any sort of blocking to deal with that splice. And I don't really want to have any loose ends because that's going to allow uplift, which I'm really trying to eliminate with this whole process. If I had thought about this ahead of time, I could have used the bird blocking as a nailing surface, but the bird blocking was a bit of an afterthought, and I'm actually pretty pleased with how the furring strips turned out. So that was all on the south side, but here's a close-up of the notches that I routed out on the north side of the rafters. You can see how laser straight this is because I pulled a tight string to establish a chalk line across, and that's a lot more accurate than trying to measure from the bird blocking or from the end of the rafter tails. All right, everyone. As you can see, I made great progress yesterday. The bird blocking is done. That's what fills the gap between the top plate and where the roofing is going to go between the rafters. I used the cutoff scraps because these boards are all about 12 feet long, and I only needed a few feet for the rafters, approximately 6 feet. So yeah, plenty of scraps for blocking. I got those furring strips up, and as you can see, everything was kind of run long past the end of the building. And I did that because there's overhangs. And instead of using those giant reclaimed 2x8s for just a non-structural overhang, I'm going to get more out of our stockpile here. So what I'm actually going to do is take one of those 2x8s, rip it in half from the table saw, and that'll give me approximately two 2x4s to use for the overhang. I guess you call it a subfascia, but they're essentially going to be flying rafters that don't have the bird's mouth cut out of them. And I have to attach them with 2x4 ladder blocking, which are also called outriggers. You'll see what I'm talking about. I'm going to go ahead and get these boards, get a time lapse going, show you exactly what I'm doing here. I chose some fairly straight 2x8s to rip, and you can see here my battery-powered table saw cuts these old-growth pine boards just fine. You'll notice this is a very long board, and I don't have a partner or an outfeed table, so after I put it halfway through, I balance it on the table saw, walk to the other side, and then pull it through. I'm taking care to keep my fingers and hands away from the spinning blade, and then once the cut is made, I turn off the table saw to make everything safe. I'm going to stage these 2x4s on the trailer for a few minutes while I deal with the excess on the structural ridge beam. I'm cutting this to length based on the width of my roofing panels, and I'm trying to keep this building very symmetrical, so the overhangs are going to be the exact same on both ends. And now it's time to deal with the outriggers. So if you look closely, you'll notice that if I added another rafter for the overhang, I'd be able to attach it at the top to the structural ridge beam, but there's nowhere at the bottom because the wall doesn't extend out to where the overhang is. So there's no support on the bottom, and these furring strips are much too small to hold the full weight of an overhang. So that's where the ladder blocking, or outriggers as they call them, come in handy. I'm notching out the top of this 2x8, which is perfectly fine because of how thick the board is. I'm not compromising the structural integrity. I'm going to put a notch down there, just like I did with the router, but I have to go significantly deeper. I need my notch to be 1.5 inches deep to accommodate the full depth of this 2x4, and that's beyond the capabilities of my trim router. But this doesn't need to be that fancy. I'm able to knock the debris out with a hammer and then use a chisel to clean it up. And you'll see in a few seconds how this 2x4 perfectly fits down into this notch. But the real logic behind this is that you need a block long enough to span over 2 rafters. The notched rafter acts as a pivot point, and it spans all the way to the next rafter inside the chicken coop. If you just secured it to that outside rafter, then it would simply fall off. You really need this overlap to go at least 1 rafter inward. But this is only one method you could use. There's another technique I've seen where you assemble the entire overhang on the ground. You have the subfascia and a parallel framing board connected with blocks that looks like a ladder, but then you'd have to bolt that entire assembly onto the building. I prefer this method because it uses less lumber, and I can use scrap wood for the ladder outriggers themselves. But I could see that if you were using 2x4 framing or trusses, you might not be able to notch the wood because it would compromise the structure. And so you might have to bolt an overhang on. But if you went out of your way to have all of that engineered, you should have just had the outer trusses dropped so you could have your overhangs overlapping on top of the walls. The first step in installing the subfascia is to cut the top end at the same angle as your roof pitch, because you need to accommodate 2 of these boards on the same ridge beam. And similar to how I handled the splice on my furring strips, I need to angle the nail or the screw so it can both meet in that same board. You want the seam to be dead center, so when you look at it from below, everything looks symmetrical. And then I'm using that screw as a pivot point to adjust the subfascia board so it maintains the plane of the roof rafters. You can see this is way longer than it needs to be. I'm going to cut that last to match the rafter tails. But for some reason here, I decided to just leave it long and deal with that excess later. Although it would have been a lot easier to hold onto this board if it was lighter weight and cut to length to begin with. But you can do it however you want. This is just how I did it. And here I am repeating the process for the north part of the roof slope. And just to get up on the ladder, I have to balance this board in place. Thankfully, there's a fence just north of the building that I can balance it on, but it's actually kind of dangerous, so I have to kind of hold on to it as I go up the ladder. What I'm doing this time is I'm securing it to the outrigger or ladder block, whatever you want to call it, because it's roughly in the middle of the board and it's going to take the weight and not make this droop too much while I relocate the ladder to the center of the building. And then once I get up to the middle there, I'll be able to angle the screws appropriately to keep my splice between the 2 subfascia very centered and very symmetrical. I'm using 3-inch decking screws for this because I don't like to put nails through the end grain of wood if I can help it. I think the angle might help this bite a bit more, but also structural screws are very strong anyway. Just to reinforce the ladder blocking, I'm putting another 2x4 on there perpendicular to the original one. This might not be necessary, but a 2x4 has a lot more strength sitting upright on its edge than it does on its flat side. So that's kind of my logic behind this. I'm actually not 100% sure what the building code says about this for residential purposes, but this is definitely overbuilt for a chicken coop. I just understand the value of overhangs, and I want to make sure we can keep stuff around the building from getting wet, and it'll also protect the siding from rain damage over the years. I mentioned earlier that I was going to cut the subfascia boards at the same length as the rafter tails. Well, now is the time. I'm simply riding my circular saw along a speed square to make a 90-degree cut because I'm not installing trim. I always like to test my cuts and my techniques on the back of the building before I move to the front, because the front is going to be seen and used a lot more than the back. In this case, I did the subfascia on the back first, refined my technique in moving my way to the front. I am cutting the notches for the outriggers, also known as ladder blocking. But this time I'm cutting the subfascia to length first because it's going to cut that weight in half, and it's going to make it a lot easier to place while I'm up on the ladder. So I'm tacking it to the outrigger first as a pivot point, and then I am doing angled screws into the structural ridge beam because that's where the splice point is. And then I'm reinforcing the ladder blocking, and then I'm moving on to some other odds and ends. But here is a close-up of basically what the finished product is. You can see all of the furring strips terminating at the subfascia, and I had to use a scrap board as a support to hold up those furring strips. That's it for the roof rafters. Go ahead and subscribe to Kind Heart Homestead if you want to see more episodes in this build series. The next episode is where we tackle the metal roofing on top of this chicken coop, and I hope to see you back here next time on Kind Heart Homestead. Thanks for watching.